Today we turn our attention to a decision that on the surface appears administrative, but in reality signals a deeper shift in Eurasian geopolitics. In late 2025, Russia announced visa-free entry for Chinese citizens, allowing tourists and business travelers to enter the country for short stays without the traditional bureaucratic barriers. This move builds on earlier bilateral arrangements, but its timing is what makes it significant. It comes as Moscow faces sustained pressure from the West and Beijing continues to expand its global economic footprint. Far beyond tourism, this policy reflects changing priorities, strategic trust, and an accelerating realignment between two major powers whose partnership is reshaping trade, finance, and influence across the region. It begins quietly, almost bureaucratically, with an announcement that could easily be overlooked amid louder headlines of war, sanctions, and summits. Yet beneath the surface, Russia's decision to open its borders to Chinese citizens without visas signals something far more consequential than a tourism initiative. It reflects a recalibration of national priorities at a moment when global alignments are shifting and traditional barriers, economic, political, even cultural, are being selectively dismantled to serve strategic ends. When borders change, power often follows. For Russia, mobility has become a tool of statecraft. The promise of visa-free access for Chinese travelers, whether for leisure or commerce, is not simply about attracting visitors. It is about reorienting the flow of people, capital, and influence eastward after years of tightening isolation from the West. Since 2022, Russia's access to European travel, investment, and financial networks has steadily contracted. What remains is the need to replace lost connections with alternatives that are not merely symbolic but sustainable. China, with its vast population, capital reserves, and growing appetite for overseas engagement, represents the most logical anchor for that shift. The mechanics of the policy reveal how carefully it has been calibrated. Allowing short stays without visas lowers friction without opening the door to long-term migration concerns, a balance Moscow has long tried to maintain. It encourages movement while preserving control. For Chinese tourists, Russia becomes more accessible at a time when European destinations remain politically complicated. For Chinese businesses, particularly small and medium-sized enterprises, it removes one layer of uncertainty in exploring Russian markets, supply chains, and partnerships. Each individual journey may appear minor, but collectively they form channels through which economic and political trust can deepen. This decision also builds on a longer trajectory of bilateral integration that predates the current geopolitical rupture. Russia and China have spent more than a decade incrementally reducing barriers between them, from energy pipelines and currency settlements to student exchanges and cross-border infrastructure. Visa facilitation has been discussed before, tested in limited regions, and gradually normalized through group travel agreements. What changes now is scale and intent. By making the policy unilateral and nationwide, Moscow signals urgency. It is no longer experimenting, it is committing. Timing matters. As Western sanctions restrict Russian airlines, banks, and technology imports, the country faces a narrowing of options. Tourism revenue, once heavily reliant on European visitors, collapsed almost overnight. Domestic tourism filled some gaps, but not enough to compensate for lost foreign spending. Chinese travelers, historically among the world's highest spenders abroad, offer an economic lifeline. Hotels, transport networks, retailers, and regional governments stand to benefit. Yet the deeper value lies in normalization. The sight of Chinese citizens moving freely through Russian cities reinforces the image of a country that remains connected, functional, and open, at least to those outside the Western Bloc. For Beijing, the benefits are different but no less strategic. Visa-free access lowers costs and risks for Chinese firms operating in an increasingly fragmented global economy. Russia offers energy security, agricultural supplies, and a vast testing ground for yuan-based trade and payment systems. Easier travel supports on-the-ground coordination, inspections, negotiations, and relationship building that digital platforms cannot fully replace. It also strengthens China's influence in shaping Russia's economic recovery, embedding Chinese standards, platforms, and commercial practices more deeply into the Russian system. There is also a psychological dimension. Movement creates familiarity, and familiarity reduces resistance. As more Chinese citizens experience Russia directly, narratives shaped exclusively by Western media lose some potency. Conversely, Russian exposure to Chinese culture, language, and bus. INS norms increases acceptance of China as the country's primary external partner. Over time, this softens domestic debate about dependency risks. strategic alignment becomes not just a policy choice but a lived reality. Critics inside and outside Russia note potential asymmetries. Visa-free access primarily benefits Chinese citizens, whose outbound numbers dwarf inbound Russian travel to China. This imbalance reflects broader structural realities. China's economic gravity is far stronger and its leverage grows accordingly. Moscow appears willing to accept this trade-off, prioritizing immediate connectivity over long-term parity. The calculation suggests that Russian policymakers see greater danger in isolation than in imbalance, at least in the near term. Internationally, the move sends a clear signal. While many countries tighten borders in response to security concerns and migration pressures, Russia is selectively opening its doors to a strategic partner. This selective openness underscores a broader trend toward bloc-based mobility, where visas and access are granted not universally but politically. Travel becomes another layer of alignment, reinforcing divisions between rival systems rather than bridging them. The discussion of reciprocity further highlights the cautious pragmatism at play. While reciprocal arrangements remain under consideration, Beijing has not rushed to mirror the policy. China traditionally moves slowly on visa liberalization, weighing domestic security and labor considerations carefully. Russia's unilateral step can therefore be read as an overture, a demonstration of goodwill designed to encourage deeper concessions later. Whether China responds in kind will reveal much about the balance of confidence and control in the relationship. Beyond economics, the policy carries security implications that Moscow will manage closely. Increased foreign presence demands stronger monitoring, data collection, and coordination between agencies. Russia's security apparatus is well aware of these challenges, yet appears confident it can mitigate risks through targeted enforcement and technological oversight. The willingness to accept these risks underscores how central the China relationship has become to Russia's strategic outlook. This development also fits within a broader pattern of Russia expanding visa-free or simplified access to countries across Asia, the Middle East, and parts of Africa. Collectively, these moves redraw Russia's human geography, connecting it more tightly to the global south while Europe drifts further away. Over time, such shifts influence everything from airline routes and language education to investment priorities and diplomatic focus. Borders, once redrawn, tend to reshape societies in subtle but lasting ways. The deeper question is whether this policy marks a temporary adjustment or a permanent realignment. If Western relations remain frozen, Russia's incentive to deepen people-to-people ties with China will only grow. What begins as tourism facilitation could evolve into broader labor mobility, educational exchange, and joint innovation ecosystems. Each step would further entrench the partnership, making reversal increasingly costly. As early 2026 approaches and implementation begins, the true impact will unfold not in press releases, but in airports, hotels, boardrooms, and border checkpoints. The numbers will tell one story, but the patterns will tell another, where people go, who they meet, and what they build together. In a world where alliances are hardening and globalization is fragmenting, even the simple act of crossing a border without a visa can reveal where the future is quietly being assembled. The announcement of visa-free travel does not exist in isolation. It is the latest visible layer of a relationship that has been thickening steadily beneath the surface, long before borders were opened and formalities removed. To understand why this step matters, one has to step back and examine how Russia and China have been quietly restructuring their partnership into something far more resilient than a transactional alliance of convenience. What we are witnessing is not a sudden embrace, but the cumulative effect of years of recalibration driven by pressure, opportunity, and a shared reading of where global power is heading. The modern acceleration of Russia-China cooperation began as a pragmatic response to constraint. As Western sanctions progressively limited Russia's access to capital, technology, and markets, Moscow was forced to reorient its economic gravity. China, facing its own strategic rivalry with the United States, emerged as a natural counterpart. The overlap was not ideological but structural. Both states sought to reduce vulnerability to Western-controlled systems while preserving room for maneuver. Trade became the first arena where this convergence took concrete form, and the numbers tell a story of adaptation rather than collapse. Despite sanctions, bilateral trade did not merely survive. It expanded, driven by commodities, manufactured goods, and an increasingly complex web of intermediate products flowing in both directions. Energy sits at the core of this relationship, but it is no longer the entire story. Russia's role as a supplier of oil, gas, and coal to China has deepened, supported by long-term contracts that bypass traditional pricing benchmarks and increasingly rely on local currencies. These arrangements provide Moscow with predictable revenue streams and Beijing with strategic insulation from maritime chokepoints and volatile global markets. Yet energy alone does not explain the durability of the partnership. Infrastructure has followed, binding geography to strategy. Rail corridors, port developments, and cross-border logistics hubs are reshaping Eurasian trade routes, gradually shifting flows away from routes dominated by Western-controlled insurance, shipping, and finance. Military technical cooperation adds another layer, one that is often misunderstood. While the two countries stop short of a formal alliance, their defense ties reflect a level of trust that would have been unthinkable 2 decades ago. Joint exercises, technology exchanges, and coordination on regional security issues signal alignment without dependency. For Russia, China offers a market and a partner less constrained by Western export controls. For China, Russia provides operational experience and strategic depth at a time when its own security environment is becoming more complex. This cooperation reinforces a shared interest in resisting external pressure without locking either side into automatic commitments. Against this backdrop, the visa-free regime appears less like a symbolic gesture and more like connective tissue. Economic integration does not function on contracts alone, it requires human presence. Engineers overseeing projects, traders negotiating supply chains, technicians maintaining infrastructure, and entrepreneurs scouting opportunities all depend on mobility. By removing administrative barriers, Russia lowers the cost of interaction and accelerates the pace at which cooperation translates from agreements into outcomes. Each visit shortens feedback loops, reduces misunderstandings, and deepens institutional familiarity. Over time, these seemingly mundane interactions shape decision-making at higher levels. Cultural integration, often dismissed as secondary, plays a strategic role here as well. As contact increases, so does the normalization of partnership. Language study expands, media narratives adjust, and public perceptions evolve. This matters because durable alliances are sustained not only by elites but by societies that come to see cooperation as natural rather than imposed. For Russia, where public opinion has historically been oriented toward Europe, increased exposure to China helps reframe national identity in a more Eurasian direction. For China, engagement with Russia reinforces its image as a central player across the continent, not confined to East Asia. The financial dimension cannot be ignored. Growing trade volumes have accelerated experimentation with non-dollar settlements, banking links, and payment systems that operate outside Western oversight. These mechanisms are still imperfect, but each transaction processed beyond traditional channels reduces collective exposure to sanctions risk. Visa-free travel supports this shift by enabling closer coordination between financial institutions, regulators, and corporate actors. Trust, in finance as much as in politics, is built face-to-face. Removing barriers to travel quietly strengthens the infrastructure of de-dollarization and financial autonomy. There is, however, an asymmetry that both sides recognize. China's economy is significantly larger, its technological base broader, and its leverage greater. Russia enters this partnership from a position of necessity, while China does so from a position of choice. The visa-free policy reflects Moscow's willingness to accept this imbalance in exchange for stability and relevance. Beijing, for its part, benefits from access without assuming formal obligations. This dynamic shapes the rhythm of cooperation. Russia moves faster, China moves carefully, and the relationship advances through incremental alignment rather than dramatic commitments. Regionally, the implications extend beyond the two countries themselves. Central Asia, the Arctic, and parts of Eastern Europe become arenas where increased Russia-China coordination reshapes local calculations. Infrastructure projects attract Chinese capital under Russian security umbrellas. Energy flows alter regional pricing and dependency patterns. Mobility between Russia and China reinforces these trends by facilitating coordination across vast distances. The partnership becomes not just bilateral but spatial, influencing how entire regions integrate into the global economy. Western PO. Policymakers watch these developments with concern but often misread their nature. The focus tends to fall on formal agreements or headline figures, overlooking the quieter processes that make partnerships durable. Visa-free travel does not grab attention like a pipeline or a weapons system, yet it may prove just as consequential. It signals confidence, commitment, and a willingness to invest politically in long-term integration. Once societies adapt to new patterns of movement, reversing them becomes politically costly. At the same time, this cooperation remains bounded by mutual caution. Russia guards its sovereignty fiercely, wary of becoming overly dependent on any single partner. China, experienced in asymmetric relationships, avoids steps that would entangle it directly in Russia's conflicts. The visa-free regime operates within these constraints, expanding interaction without crossing red lines. It is a controlled opening, calibrated to maximize benefit while limiting exposure. As implementation approaches, the real test will lie in scale and continuity. If flows of people grow steadily, if business networks deepen, and if cultural familiarity increases, the policy will have achieved its strategic purpose. If, however, economic conditions deteriorate or political calculations shift, its impact may remain limited. What is clear is that this step reflects a broader logic. Cooperation that once depended on necessity is increasingly reinforced by structure. In a world where alliances are fragmenting and globalization is becoming more selective, the strengthening of Russia-China ties through practical measures like visa-free travel reveals how power adapts under pressure. It shows how states use economic integration, mobility, and infrastructure to compensate for exclusion elsewhere. The question that now hangs in the air is not whether this partnership will deepen further, but how far it can go before its internal imbalances begin to shape its limits. Isolation is a strategy that only works if alternatives are denied. Since 2022, the Western approach toward Russia has rested on a clear assumption that economic pressure, diplomatic exclusion, and financial restrictions would steadily narrow Moscow's room to maneuver until policy change became unavoidable. What has unfolded instead is a more complicated reality, one that reveals as much about the limits of modern economic warfare as it does about Russia's capacity to adapt. The visa-free opening to China must be understood against this backdrop, not as defiance for its own sake, but as a response to an environment where exclusion has become permanent rather than conditional. Sanctions were designed to sever Russia from the networks that define global commerce: capital markets, advanced technology supply chains, insurance, shipping, and the credibility conferred by participation in Western-led institutions. In the early stages, the shock was real. Financial markets convulsed, access to foreign currency tightened, and entire sectors faced sudden uncertainty. Yet over time, the pressure revealed a structural flaw. The global economy is no longer unified enough for isolation to be total. Parallel systems exist, imperfect but usable, and Russia moved quickly to embed itself within them. China was central to this recalibration, not because it offered charity, but because its own interests aligned with resisting a world where access is conditional on political compliance. As Western doors closed, Eastern channels widened. Trade routes were rerouted, payment mechanisms adjusted, and investment flows redirected. These were not emergency measures alone. They evolved into long-term arrangements that reduced exposure to future shocks. Each adaptation reduced the marginal impact of additional sanctions, slowly eroding their deterrent power. Beyond China, Russia's engagement with broader non-Western groupings took on new urgency. Platforms such as BRICS became more than diplomatic talking shops. They functioned as signaling mechanisms, demonstrating that Russia was not alone and that alternatives to Western-centric governance structures were viable. Membership and partnerships provided political cover, market access, and opportunities for coordination on finance, energy, and development. The expansion of these forums diluted the stigma of isolation and reframed Russia's position as part of a larger contest over global order. Trade redirection played a decisive role in this process. Commodities that once flowed primarily toward Europe found new destinations, often at discounted prices but with higher volumes and longer-term contracts. Manufactured goods followed similar patterns, supported by logistics investments that reduced dependence on traditional transit routes. Over time, these adjustments hardened into new trade geographies. What began as improvisation became infrastructure, making reversal increasingly costly even if sanctions were lifted. Financial adaptation followed a similar trajectory. Exclusion from Western payment systems accelerated experimentation with alternative settlement methods, currency swaps, and domestic financial instruments. While these systems lacked the efficiency and depth of established networks, they offered something equally valuable: autonomy. Each transaction processed outside Western oversight reduced vulnerability to future freezes and seizures. Visa-free mobility supports this financial realignment by enabling the human relationships that make trust-based systems function. Diplomatically, isolation produced unintended consequences. By narrowing Russia's engagement with the West, it reduced channels for influence while strengthening incentives to invest elsewhere. Engagement shifted from multilateral Western forums to bilateral and regional arrangements where Moscow could negotiate on more equal terms. This did not eliminate constraints, but it changed the terrain. Instead of operating within rules it did not shape, Russia sought spaces where norms were still contested. The psychological dimension of isolation is often underestimated. Sanctions are not only economic tools, they are messages about legitimacy and belonging. Over time, repeated signals of exclusion can produce resignation rather than compliance. In Russia's case, this manifested as a recalibration of identity. Political discourse increasingly emphasized sovereignty, resilience, and civilizational distinctiveness. Partnerships with non-Western states reinforced this narrative, making alignment with Asia and the global South appear not as a fallback, but as a strategic choice. China's role in this process is frequently mischaracterized as opportunistic exploitation. While asymmetries certainly exist, the relationship is more nuanced. Beijing has been careful to avoid direct confrontation with the West on Russia's behalf, calibrating its support to protect its own interests. At the same time, it has benefited from discounted resources, expanded influence, and a partner willing to align on broader systemic issues. This balance of caution and engagement reflects China's long-term approach to power accumulation. The visa-free initiative fits neatly into this adaptive ecosystem. By facilitating movement, it accelerates the integration of business networks, educational exchanges, and cultural familiarity that underpin durable partnerships. These human connections are harder to sanction than financial flows or commodities. They create constituencies with vested interests in continuity, making political reversals more complex. In this sense, mobility becomes a form of strategic insulation. Western isolation efforts have also faced coordination challenges. Divergent national interests, domestic political pressures, and economic costs have complicated enforcement. As time passes, maintaining unity becomes harder, especially when alternative markets absorb much of the displaced trade. Russia's ability to demonstrate continued engagement elsewhere weakens the narrative of isolation and strengthens voices arguing for recalibration rather than escalation. None of this suggests that sanctions have failed outright. They have constrained growth, limited technological access, and imposed real costs. But their effectiveness depends on the absence of substitutes. As substitutes multiply, the pressure diffuses. Russia's eastward pivot, supported by China and reinforced through mechanisms like visa-free travel, illustrates how adaptation reshapes the balance between punishment and resilience. The broader implication is sobering. In a fragmented global system, isolation becomes relative rather than absolute. Power shifts from those who control access to those who can build alternatives. This dynamic does not favor stability, it encourages parallel systems and competing norms. The more these systems solidify, the harder it becomes to restore a shared framework for cooperation. As Russia continues to integrate with non-Western partners, the question is no longer whether isolation has worked, but what kind of world it is producing. A world of overlapping spheres, limited interoperability, and reduced trust carries risks for all participants. The visa-free opening to China is a small but telling indicator of this trajectory. It reflects a choice to invest in permanence rather than wait for reintegration. What remains uncertain is how far this realignment can go before its own constraints emerge. Economic asymmetries, strategic mistrust, and divergent long-term goals could slow momentum. Yet for now, the direction is clear. Isolation has not halted Russia's engagement with the world, it has redirected it. And as these new connections deepen, the costs of reversing course grow steadily higher, shaping a future where division, not integration, becomes the default condition of global politics. Power rarely disappears under pressure, it reconfigures. When access is restricted, influence looks for new core corridors, often quieter ones that operate beneath headlines and beyond familiar institutions. The growing connectivity between Russia and China is one such corridor, not dramatic in any single move but cumulative in effect. It signals a deeper shift in how states respond when confronted with sustained exclusion and what that response means for the balance of global power. For decades, Western leverage rested on a near monopoly over the systems that mattered most: finance, trade rules, security architecture, and legitimacy itself. Alignment with these systems promised growth and stability, while exclusion imposed visible costs. That logic assumed a relatively unified global order. What has changed is not merely Russia's position within that order, but the order's capacity to enforce conformity. As Moscow deepens engagement with Beijing, it exposes the limits of pressure in a world where alternatives, however imperfect, are increasingly available. Russia's alignment with China is often portrayed as reactive, but it is also strategic. Long before sanctions hardened, Russian policymakers debated the risks of overdependence on Western markets and institutions. The current phase accelerates choices already under consideration. By anchoring itself more firmly in Asia, Russia reduces its vulnerability to Western policy cycles, elections, and shifting norms. This does not eliminate dependence, it redistributes it, trading one set of constraints for another that appears, at least for now, more predictable. China's calculus is different but complementary. Beijing has little interest in inheriting Russia's confrontations, yet it benefits from a partner willing to challenge Western primacy. Enhanced connectivity with Russia strengthens China's access to resources, markets, and strategic depth. It also reinforces a broader narrative that the global system is no longer singular, that pathways to influence exist outside Western approval. This narrative resonates across much of the global South, where historical grievances and development priorities often clash with Western conditionality. The geopolitical implications extend well beyond bilateral ties. As Russia and China tighten links, they create gravitational pull for other states seeking flexibility. Countries that prefer not to choose sides watch carefully. Each successful workaround, each functioning alternative lowers the perceived risk of diversification. Over time, this changes behavior. States hedge more openly, sign overlapping agreements, and resist pressure to align exclusively with any single bloc. The result is not a clean break, but a gradual dilution of Western centrality. Regional dynamics in Asia are particularly affected. Russia's deeper engagement with China reorients its strategic focus eastward, increasing its stake in Asian stability while complicating existing balances. Central Asia becomes a space of careful coordination rather than competition, as both powers seek influence without destabilizing the region. Northeast Asia must account for a Russia that is no longer peripheral but economically and diplomatically intertwined with China. This does not create a unified front, but it introduces new variables into an already complex security environment. Beyond Asia, the ripple effects reach Europe, the Middle East, and Africa. European policymakers face a Russia less isolated than anticipated, one that can sustain external relationships despite sanctions. In the Middle East, Moscow's partnerships appear more resilient, supported by alternative economic ties. In Africa, the message is subtle but clear. Engagement with Russia does not necessarily mean isolation from global flows. These perceptions matter as much as material outcomes, shaping diplomatic choices and long-term alignments. The diversification of global alliances carries consequences for international institutions. Organizations designed around Western leadership struggle to adapt to a more plural environment. Voting blocs fragment, consensus becomes harder, and enforcement mechanisms weaken. As Russia and China coordinate more closely within parallel forums, they contribute to the normalization of a multipolar institutional landscape. This does not replace existing structures overnight. It competes with them, slowly eroding their exclusivity. Economic implications follow geopolitical ones. Enhanced connectivity encourages the development of trade routes, payment systems, and standards that bypass traditional hubs. These alternatives may lack efficiency at first, but they improve through use. Each transaction settled outside Western frameworks reduces reliance on them, incrementally shifting leverage. Over time, this can affect everything from currency dominance to regulatory influence, reshaping how economic power is exercised. Security dynamics are also influenced, though often indirectly. Closer Russia-China ties complicate Western deterrence strategies by blurring threat perceptions. Coordination does not require formal alliances to be effective. Shared interests and parallel actions can suffice. This ambiguity forces Western planners to consider multiple theaters simultaneously, stretching resources and attention. It also raises the stakes of miscalculation, as actions intended to signal resolve in one context may have unintended consequences in another. At the same time, alignment carries risks for its participants. Russia must manage asymmetry carefully to avoid becoming the junior partner in a relationship defined by China's economic weight. China must balance support with caution, ensuring that engagement does not trigger destabilizing backlash. These tensions limit how far cooperation can go, but they do not negate its significance. Even constrained alignment can alter the strategic environment. What emerges is a world less defined by blocks than by networks. Influence flows through relationships rather than institutions alone. States navigate this environment by maximizing options rather than committing to rigid camps. Western efforts to isolate Russia highlight the challenge of applying tools designed for a more centralized system to a fragmented one. The tools still bite, but they no longer decide outcomes on their own. The broader implication is that power is becoming more diffuse and more contested. No single actor can fully control access or dictate terms. Connectivity itself becomes a form of leverage, and those who can build and sustain it gain resilience. Russia's growing alignment with China exemplifies this shift, illustrating how pressure can accelerate the formation of alternative pathways rather than close them. Looking ahead, the key question is not whether Western influence will vanish, but how it will coexist with competing centers of gravity. A diversified alliance landscape may reduce the effectiveness of coercion while increasing the importance of negotiation and compromise. It may also produce instability as norms diverge and coordination becomes harder. The trajectory set by enhanced Russia-China connectivity suggests a future where influence is negotiated across overlapping systems, and where isolation, once a decisive weapon, becomes increasingly difficult to enforce. This brings us to the end of our examination of Russia's visa-free entry decision for Chinese citizens and what it reveals about the deeper trajectory of Moscow-Beijing relations. Beyond tourism and business travel, the policy reflects a broader realignment shaped by sanctions, shifting power centers, and the search for long-term strategic resilience. As global alliances continue to evolve, such seemingly administrative moves offer clues about where influence is flowing and how the international order is quietly adjusting. What matters now is not just the policy itself, but how these incremental changes accumulate in the years ahead.